I am Judith Reynolds, 57 years old, standing in front of my million-dollar home as water surges through the foundation. After 30 years of marriage, Richard called me old and dead to him before leaving me for his 2 8-year-old assistant. When he demanded half of everything in the divorce, including the house I designed, I made a decision. If he wanted our home, he could have it 6 feet under. What I never expected was that my own son would betray me too. Before I tell you what happened, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you've ever dealt with betrayal, hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of women who refuse to be victims. Trust me, you'll want to stick around to see how I turned my heartbreak into the most satisfying revenge. Richard and I met in college. He was studying business, and I was in design school. We were young, ambitious, and madly in love. After graduation, we married in a small ceremony with just our closest friends and family. We had big dreams and even bigger determination. While Richard worked at a small real estate firm, I started taking on interior design clients. We saved every penny, and within 5 years, we had enough for a down payment on our first investment property. That's how Reynolds Real Estate was born. Richard handled the business side, finding undervalued properties, while I transformed them with my design skills. We flipped houses before it was trendy, gradually building our empire from nothing. When I discovered I was pregnant with Bradley, we were overjoyed, but also at a crossroads. Our business was finally taking off, but someone needed to be there for our son. "I'll put my career on hold," I told Richard, "just until Bradley starts school." That temporary pause turned into years. While I occasionally took on design projects, I primarily became the supportive wife and mother. I threw perfect dinner parties for Richard's clients, volunteered at Bradley's school, and maintained our increasingly luxurious home. By our 15th anniversary, Reynolds Real Estate had become one of the most successful firms in the state. We moved into what would be our dream home, a stunning 6-bedroom colonial on 3 acres in the most prestigious neighborhood. I spent 2 years designing every inch of that house, creating a showplace that was featured in several design magazines. We had it all: the country club membership, the luxury cars, annual European vacations, and a solid place among the city's elite. Bradley grew into a smart, handsome young man who excelled at everything he tried. On the surface, we were the perfect family. The first signs of trouble were subtle. Richard started working later and later. His phone would buzz at odd hours, and he'd take calls in another room. When I asked about the changes, he dismissed my concerns. "The business is expanding, Judith. Someone has to keep the money flowing for this lifestyle you enjoy so much." I noticed other changes too. Richard started going to the gym daily, bought a new wardrobe, and suddenly cared about appearing younger. I attributed it to a typical midlife crisis. He had just turned 55, after all. Then came the perfume. It wasn't mine. Something floral and youthful that I found on his collar one evening while doing laundry. When confronted, he claimed it must belong to a client he'd shown a property to that day. I wanted to believe him. 30 years of marriage builds a foundation of trust that isn't easily broken. But the comments about my appearance began shortly after. "Have you thought about Botox?" he asked casually over breakfast one morning. "Patricia Marshall just had it done, and she looks 10 years younger. You might want to color your hair," he suggested another time, reaching out to touch the strands of silver that had appeared among my blonde locks. "The gray is aging you." After decades of complimenting my natural beauty and praising my choice to age gracefully, these comments stung. Still, I tried to dismiss them as his own insecurities projecting onto me. Our 30th anniversary was approaching, and I decided to plan a special evening. I made reservations at the restaurant where we'd celebrated our first anniversary, bought a new dress that flattered my figure, and scheduled a full day at the spa. I was determined to rekindle the romance and connection that seemed to be fading between us. Little did I know that evening would mark the end of everything I thought was real in my life. I spent the entire day of our anniversary preparing. The spa treatment left my skin glowing. My hair was freshly styled, and the navy blue dress I'd purchased accentuated my figure while minimizing the signs of age that Richard had become so critical of lately. I made dinner reservations for 7 p.m. at La Maison, the French restaurant where we'd celebrated so many special occasions. At 6:30 p.m., I called Richard's office to make sure he was on his way. His secretary, a woman who'd worked for him for 15 years, answered nervously. I'm sorry, Mrs. Reynolds. Mr. Reynolds left early today. He mentioned something about an important meeting. My stomach tightened. I called his cell phone straight to voicemail. I texted no response. By 7:30 p.m., sitting alone at our reserved table with an untouched glass of champagne, I knew something was very wrong. At 9 p.m., I drove to his office building. The main entrance was locked, but I had a key. The elevator ride to the 12th floor felt interminable. The reception area was dark, but I could see light coming from under Richard's office door at the end of the hallway. I heard them before I saw them laughter, the clink of glasses, music playing softly. I stood frozen, my hand on the doorknob, knowing that opening it would forever change my life. When I finally pushed the door open, the scene before me confirmed my worst fears. Richard was lounging on the leather sofa, his shirt unbuttoned, a glass of scotch in hand. And there she was, Megan Thompson, his 8-year-old assistant, perched on his lap, her lipstick smeared, hair disheveled. The remains of an intimate dinner for two were scattered on his desk, along with an empty bottle of champagne. "Judith!" Richard stood abruptly, causing Megan to stumble off his lap. "What are you doing here?" "It's our anniversary," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening inside me. "Oh." He had the decency to look momentarily ashamed before his expression hardened. "Well, this saves me having to tell you later." "Tell me what?" I already knew, but I needed to hear him say it. "This isn't working anymore, Judith. Us. The marriage. I've tried, but I need something different now." "Different?" I echoed. "Younger," he clarified, as Megan awkwardly adjusted her clothing beside him. "You're almost 60, for God's sake. I look at you, and all I see is someone old and tired. You're like a walking reminder of my own mortality." Each word cut like glass. 30 years of marriage, and that's all you have to say? What do you want me to say? That I'm sorry? I'm not. Megan makes me feel alive. When I'm with her, I feel 30 again. With you, I feel ancient. You're old, Judith. You're old and dead to me. I stumbled back as if physically struck. Megan had the grace to look uncomfortable, but not enough to remove her hand from Richard's arm. "I want a divorce," Richard continued, his voice businesslike now. "I've already spoken with my attorney. We'll split everything 50-50, including the house. In fact, once it's settled, I plan to sell it. Megan and I want to build something new, something that's ours. The house. My house. The home I had poured my heart and soul into designing. The thought of him selling it to finance his new life with this girl was unbearable. I left without another word, driving home in a state of shock. The house was dark and quiet when I arrived, highlighting its emptiness. I kicked off my heels in the foyer, walked straight to our bedroom, and mechanically removed my anniversary dress, the expensive lingerie I'd bought, and the jewelry I'd carefully selected. I sat on the edge of our king-sized bed, naked and shivering despite the warm night, feeling stripped of everything: my marriage, my identity, my future. The tears came then, violent sobs that bent me double. I cried until there was nothing left, until I was empty and hollowed out. Around midnight, the front door opened and closed. Footsteps on the stairs, then a soft knock at the bedroom door. "Mom?" It was Bradley, home from his apartment in the city. "Mom, are you okay?" I got a weird call from Dad. I pulled on a robe and opened the door to my son's concerned face. "He told me about Megan," Bradley said, pulling me into a hug. "He's an idiot, Mom. A complete idiot." For that night, at least, I had my son's shoulder to cry on. For that night, I wasn't completely alone. What I didn't know then was how short-lived that comfort would be, or how calculating Richard had already been in ensuring he would take everything from me, including my only child. That night, as Bradley slept in his old room and I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the first seed of revenge was planted in my mind. If Richard thought he could discard me like yesterday's trash and still walk away with half of everything we'd built together, he was about to learn how wrong he was. 3 days after discovering Richard's affair, I sat in the elegant office of Barbara Weston, one of the top divorce attorneys in the state. Barbara was in her early 60s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, her silver hair cut in a sharp bob. She exuded confidence and competence, exactly what I needed. Unfortunately, Mrs. Reynolds, Michigan is a no-fault divorce state with equitable distribution laws, Barbara explained. reviewing the notes she'd taken during our 2-hour consultation. This typically means a 50-50 split of marital assets, regardless of infidelity. But I put my career on hold to raise our son and support Richard's business, I argued. I designed the homes we flipped. Without me, Reynolds Real Estate wouldn't exist. Barbara nodded sympathetically. That's why I said, typically. We'll definitely argue for a more favorable distribution based on your contributions. But I need to be honest with you from what you've told me about Richard. This won't be easy. She wasn't wrong. The following week, I received the initial divorce filing from Richard's attorney, along with a comprehensive list of our assets. Reviewing it with Barbara, we discovered significant discrepancies. He's hiding assets, Barbara said, highlighting several suspicious transfers. And look here, he's claiming the increase in the company's value was primarily due to his business acumen, minimizing your contributions. The most painful discovery came when we reviewed the section about our home. He's already in talks with potential buyers, Barbara said, her voice gentle. It seems he plans to sell the house immediately after the divorce is finalized. The thought of strangers living in my carefully designed spaces, of Richard profiting from my creation to fund his new life with Megan, made me physically ill. That house represented everything I'd sacrificed and achieved. It was more than property, it was the physical manifestation of 30 years of my life. Can we stop him? I asked. We can try to delay the sale, but ultimately, if the court awards him half ownership, he has the right to force a sale if you can't buy him out. The anger that had been building inside me since that night in Richard's office crystallized into something hard and sharp. The initial shock and heartbreak were being replaced by cold fury. I had been the perfect wife for 3 decades, only to be discarded for a younger model when Richard decided I was no longer serving his needs. 2 weeks later came the first mandatory mediation session. I dressed carefully in a conservative but stylish suit, applied subtle makeup, and held my head high as I walked into the conference room. Richard was already there, looking tanned and fit in an expensive new suit. And beside him, to my shock and the visible discomfort of both attorneys, sat Megan. Is this appropriate? Barbara whispered to Richard's attorney, Harold Mitchell. Mrs. Thompson is here as moral support, Mitchell replied smoothly. There's nothing in the rules prohibiting it. It was a calculated move designed to humiliate me, and from Richard's smirk, I could see he knew exactly what he was doing. Throughout the 4-hour session, he was condescending and dismissive of my contributions to our shared success. Judith picked out some nice curtains and paint colors, he said at one point, waving his hand dismissively. But the business decisions, the financial risks, the networking, that was all me. By the end of the mediation, it was clear no agreement would be reached. As we prepared to leave, Richard casually mentioned he'd be hosting a dinner party that weekend for key clients at our country club. Don't worry about your membership, he added with false concern. I've arranged for you to keep it through the end of the month. The news of our divorce spread quickly through our social circle. Friends I'd had for decades suddenly became unavailable. Invitations dried up. At a charity event I attended alone. I overheard Patricia Marshall, whose Botox Richard had so admired, whispering to another woman, "Poor Judith. You know, she really let herself go." Richard traded up for a newer model. The humiliation was almost unbearable. 30 years of building a life, a reputation, a community all seemingly erased in an instant. This is unfortunately common, Barbara told me during our next meeting. People take sides, and it's easier to side with the person who doesn't make them uncomfortable. Richard represents what they want to believe about marriage and aging, that there's always an escape hatch if things get too real. You represent their fears. As the legal proceedings dragged on, Richard's tactics became increasingly aggressive. He contested every financial document, demanded exhaustive inventories of personal property, and scheduled depositions designed to wear me down. He's trying to break you, Barbara said bluntly. He wants you to give up and accept whatever he offers, just to end this. Little did Richard know, with every underhanded tactic, every dismissive comment, every public humiliation, he wasn't breaking me. He was forging me into something stronger and more dangerous than he could imagine. The perfect, supportive wife was gone. In her place was a woman with nothing left to lose and a growing determination to make sure Richard lost everything. I won't break, I told Barbara as we prepared for yet another contentious hearing. I won't give him that satisfaction. What I didn't tell her was the idea that had begun to form in my mind, a plan so perfect in its vindictiveness that it would ensure Richard would never enjoy the fruits of our marriage, especially not our beloved home. The Sunday after our third failed mediation session, Bradley came over for dinner. Since the separation, these weekly dinners had become my emotional lifeline. At 30, my son had grown into a thoughtful man with his father's strong jawline, but I like to think my compassion and emotional intelligence. I prepared his favorite meal, pot roast with rosemary potatoes, and set the dining room table with care, using the good china that had been a wedding gift from my grandmother. "This looks amazing, Mom," Bradley said, kissing my cheek before taking his seat. "How are you holding up?" I poured us each a glass of Merlot before answering. "Some days are better than others. Barbara thinks your father is deliberately dragging this out to wear me down." Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "About Dad. There's something I need to tell you." The hesitation in his voice triggered a warning bell in my mind. "He's offered me a position at Reynolds Real Estate," Bradley continued, "Executive Vice President of Development." I set down my wine glass carefully. "That's a significant promotion from your current job." Bradley had been working at a mid-sized architectural firm for the past 5 years, slowly building his portfolio and reputation. The position Richard was offering would catapult him several rungs up the career ladder. "It's an incredible opportunity, Mom. I'd be overseeing all new property acquisitions and development projects." "When would this start?" I asked, my appetite vanishing. Bradley studied his plate. "I've already accepted. I start next month." The pot roast turned to ash in my mouth. "I see. Mom, this doesn't change anything between us. I still love you. I can still be here for you while working with Dad. Does he know you're here tonight?" Bradley's silence was answer enough. "He doesn't approve of you spending time with me, does he? He thinks it would be cleaner if I maintained some distance during the proceedings." Bradley finally met my eyes. "But I told him I wouldn't cut you off completely. How generous of you both." The bitterness in my voice was impossible to disguise. "Mom, please try to understand. This is my career we're talking about. I can't pass up an opportunity like this because you and Dad are having problems." "Problems?" I set down my fork with a clatter. "Your father had an affair with a woman barely older than you, told me I was old and dead to him, and is trying to take everything we built together." "Those aren't problems, Bradley. That's betrayal. People grow apart, Mom. Marriages end. It happens." I stared at my son, suddenly seeing Richard's influence in his carefully reasonable tone, the slight condescension. "Has your father told you his version of events?" I asked quietly. Bradley sighed. "He said you've been difficult about the divorce. That you're stuck in the past and refusing to accept reality. And you believe him." "I'm not taking sides," Bradley insisted, "but the damage was done." "Did you know?" The question that had been haunting me for weeks finally escaped. "About Megan." "Did you know before I did?" The flash of guilt across his face told me everything. "How long?" My voice was barely a whisper now. "Mom, I didn't think." "How long, Bradley?" "About 6 months," he admitted. "I saw them together at a restaurant when I was meeting clients. Dad said he was going to tell you, that he was just waiting for the right time." 6 months. While I was planning our anniversary dinner, while I was enduring Richard's comments about my appearance, while I was desperately trying to save my marriage, my own son had known the truth and said nothing. "I think you should leave," I said, standing abruptly. "Mom, please, let's talk about this rationally." "Rationally?" Something broke inside me then. "Your father destroys our family. You keep his secrets. And now you're taking his side for a job. But I'm supposed to be rational? I'm not taking sides. Why can't you understand that this is about my future, not about choosing between you?" "Because they're connected, Bradley. Richard is using this job offer to ensure your loyalty. He knows exactly what he's doing." "You're paranoid," Bradley snapped, his facade of reasonableness cracking. "Dad was right. You can't accept that things change. People move on. Maybe if you hadn't been so focused on being the perfect housewife and had actually developed your own life, you wouldn't be so desperate now." His words hit like physical blows. They were so clearly Richard's sentiments, but coming from my son's mouth, they were devastating. "I gave up my career for you," I said, my voice shaking, "so you could have a mother who was present, not juggling business meetings and childcare." "I never asked you to do that," Bradley retorted, standing now too. and I'm not responsible for the choices you made. Neither is Dad. Get out. Mom. Get out. I pointed toward the door, my hand trembling with rage and hurt. Bradley grabbed his coat and car keys. At the dining room doorway, he paused. I'm sorry you feel this way. When you're ready to talk like adults, call me. The front door slammed behind him, and I was alone again in the big house that had once been filled with family and love. Now it felt like a mausoleum of my failed life. That night, as I mechanically cleared the dishes and threw away the uneaten pot roast, I realized I had lost everything that mattered: my husband, my son, my social standing, and soon, my home. The neighbors who had once been friends now averted their eyes when I collected the mail. The women from my book club had quietly removed me from their group text. I sat alone in the darkened kitchen until midnight, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of complete isolation pressing down on me. For a brief, dark moment, I considered whether life was worth continuing if this was all that remained of it. Then, as the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 12, something shifted inside me. The last remnant of Judith Reynolds, the perfect wife and mother, died. In her place rose a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain through revenge. I would not be a victim. I would not slink away in shame while Richard and his child bride took over the life I had built. I would not be the cautionary tale whispered about at cocktail parties. Richard had declared me dead to him. Perhaps it was time to show him exactly what that really meant. The morning after Bradley's betrayal, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The fog of shock and grief had lifted, replaced by cold, precise determination. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and began to research. First, I delved into Michigan property laws regarding divorce. Barbara had already explained the basics, but I needed to understand every nuance, every precedent, every loophole. I spent hours reading legal websites, case studies, and forum discussions by people who had faced similar situations. One case in particular caught my attention: Donovan v. Donovan, where the wife had deliberately damaged their shared property before the final divorce settlement. The court had ruled that since the property no longer existed in its original form, neither party could claim its full value. The husband's expected windfall had evaporated. That afternoon, I called Barbara and requested a meeting with a different kind of attorney, one specializing in property damage and insurance claims. Barbara hesitated, but gave me a name: Sophia Diaz. Sophia's office was smaller than Barbara's, less polished, with law books stacked on every surface and case files piled high on her desk. She was younger, sharper, with a reputation for creative legal strategies. "Let me be clear, Mrs. Reynolds," Sophia said after I explained my situation. "I'm not advocating for property destruction. That would be unethical and potentially criminal." "Of course not," I agreed. "I'm simply exploring all potential scenarios." Sophia leaned forward. "Hypothetically speaking, if a house were to suffer catastrophic damage before a divorce was finalized, and if that damage were caused by, say, a structural issue that had been developing for years, it would significantly impact the property's value in the settlement. And if the house were insured? Insurance claims during divorce proceedings are complicated. If damage were ruled intentional, no coverage. If deemed accidental or due to neglect, partial coverage. If determined to be a pre-existing condition that worsened naturally, full coverage might apply, but the proceeds would likely be considered marital property and divided accordingly. So both parties would still lose. Sophia nodded. But not equally. The person emotionally invested in the property loses sentiment. The person planning to sell immediately loses only money. I left Sophia's office with a dangerous idea forming. As an interior designer, I knew houses intimately, their structures, their systems, their vulnerabilities. Our home, for all its grandeur, had been built on marshy land. The builder had used extra reinforcement in the foundation, but I remembered the warnings about maintaining proper drainage. What if that drainage were to fail catastrophically? That evening, I called an old friend from design school. Teresa Martinez and I had once been inseparable. But like many friendships, ours had faded as our lives took different directions. Unlike my country club acquaintances, however, Teresa had no connection to Richard and his social circle. Judith Reynolds? My God, it's been what? 10 years? Teresa's voice was warm and instantly familiar. At least, I admitted. I'm sorry I've been so out of touch. Life happens. I heard about you and Richard. Men are trash. I laughed for what felt like the first time in months. Can we get coffee? I could use a friend right now. Over the next 2 weeks, Teresa became my confidant and inadvertent accomplice. She listened without judgment as I poured out the whole sordid story: Richard's affair, the divorce proceedings, and finally, Bradley's betrayal. That little shit was Teresa's succinct response to the news about my son. After everything you've done for him, he's still my son, I said, surprising myself by defending him despite my anger. And Richard's son too, apparently, Teresa observed shrewdly. Apple doesn't fall far from the tree. It was during our third coffee date that Teresa mentioned her brother-in-law, Frank, who owned a construction company specializing in foundation repair. If you're worried about the house's structural integrity before selling, Frank could take a look, she offered innocently. No charge for an old friend. Frank turned out to be a godsend, a quiet, competent man who asked few questions and understood discretion. He inspected the house thoroughly, pointing out areas where the drainage system could be modified without obvious tampering. Old houses settle, he explained, showing me a hairline crack in the basement wall. Water finds the path of least resistance. If this crack were to widen naturally, water could begin to undermine the foundation. How long would that process take? I asked. Frank shrugged. Years, normally. Unless something accelerated it. Our eyes met in silent understanding. While this physical plan took shape, I was simultaneously documenting everything related to Richard's financial and personal misconduct. I hired a private investigator who uncovered offshore accounts Richard had been using to hide assets. The investigator also compiled evidence of Richard's affair, including timestamps proving it had begun long before our separation. I forwarded all this information to Barbara, who used it to counter Richard's increasingly aggressive legal maneuvers. He's getting nervous, Barbara reported after a preliminary hearing. The judge was not impressed by the hidden assets. With each small victory, my confidence grew. I began to dress differently, abandoning the conservative, expensive clothes Richard had approved of for bolder, more colorful styles that expressed my rediscovered personality. I cut my shoulder-length blonde hair into a chic silver bob that accentuated my cheekbones rather than trying to hide my age. The first time I encountered Richard at the courthouse with my new look, his double take was worth every penny of the salon bill. Trying to impress someone? He sneered, recovering quickly. Just being myself, I replied calmly. Something I should have done years ago. My composure clearly unsettled him. He'd expected me to remain the devastated, pleading woman he'd left behind. This new Judith, confident, stylish, unflappable, was an unwelcome surprise. His response was to escalate his harassment. Late-night phone calls, unexpected visits to the house to collect personal items, having Megan park ostentatiously in front of our home when she picked up documents for him. I documented every incident meticulously but otherwise showed no reaction. Meanwhile, Frank made regular visits to the house, ostensibly to monitor the developing foundation issues but actually to implement our plan. By early fall, everything was in place. I had quietly removed all truly sentimental items from the house: photo albums, family heirlooms, irreplaceable mementos. My personal treasures were safely stored in a rental unit under Teresa's name. The countdown had begun. The divorce trial was scheduled for November 15th, just 6 weeks away. According to Frank, our modifications to the drainage system had created a precarious situation that could be triggered at any time. The question now was timing when to unleash the destruction that would bury Richard's dreams of profiting from my heartbreak. With the foundation work secretly underway, I needed a plausible cover story for the constant presence of workers at the house. After consulting with Frank, we decided on the perfect explanation: pre-sale renovations. I informed Richard through Barbara that I was accepting reality and preparing the house for eventual sale by undertaking some necessary upgrades. He was suspicious initially, but became smug when he interpreted this as surrender. My client is pleased to see Mrs. Reynolds taking a practical approach, his attorney communicated. Mr. Reynolds requests an itemized list of all renovations and associated costs. This request played perfectly into our plan. I created a detailed proposal for cosmetic updates, kitchen modernization, bathroom renovations, new flooring, and submitted it through proper legal channels. The document was meticulous, complete with contractor quotes and timeline projections extending well beyond our court date. What the proposal didn't mention was the real work happening in the basement, crawl spaces, and surrounding grounds, where Frank and his most trusted workers were systematically compromising the drainage system and subtly weakening key structural supports. "We're creating what I call a controlled failure point," Frank explained one evening in the basement, pointing to a section of foundation wall. "When water pressure builds up outside this area, it will find the path we've created. And it will look natural?" I confirmed. Frank nodded. "To anyone except a structural engineer specifically looking for tampering, this will appear to be catastrophic but natural drainage failure due to the property's underlying soil conditions, exactly what the original builder warned about." The physical preparations continued throughout September. I coordinated the legitimate renovation contractors to arrive when Frank's crew was working on visible projects, creating a constant stream of workers that made it impossible for anyone to track who was doing what. Richard, meanwhile, had begun making surprise visits to the house, ostensibly to collect personal items he'd forgotten, but clearly to monitor my activities. During one such visit in early October, he nearly discovered Frank working on one of our modified drainage access points. I intercepted Richard in the foyer, blocking his path to the basement door. "What do you need now?" "Your golf clubs are long gone, as is your coin collection and those first edition books you accused me of hiding." "I'm looking for my grandfather's pocket watch," Richard said, trying to step around me. "The watch you're currently wearing?" I pointed to the chain visible in his vest pocket. He flushed, caught in the lie. "I have a right to inspect the property, Judith. It's still half mine. Your attorney can schedule a formal inspection through Barbara," I replied coolly. "Until then, these surprise visits need to stop. It's harassment." "You seem different," Richard said, narrowing his eyes. "Almost confident." "What are you up to?" Just adapting to my new reality, I echoed his attorney's words back to him. "Now, please leave, before I call the police and report you for trespassing." After Richard left, Frank emerged from his hiding place behind the basement door. "That was close. We need to be more careful." "He's getting suspicious," I agreed. "We need to accelerate the timeline." The court date was now just 4 weeks away, and Richard's legal team had filed a motion requesting a formal property appraisal the week before trial. If that appraisal took place, our modifications might be discovered. As pressure mounted, I found myself waking at night in cold sweats, doubting my plan. The legal consequences, if I were caught, could be severe potential criminal charges, financial penalties, loss of any favorable divorce settlement. Was revenge worth risking everything I had left? During one such 3 a.m. crisis of confidence, I called Teresa. "I can't do this," I whispered into the phone. "It's too much. I should just accept the settlement offer and move on." "Judith Reynolds, don't you dare," Teresa replied fiercely. "Remember what Richard did to you. Remember what he said. Remember how he parades that girl around town while treating you like garbage. Remember how he turned your own son against you." The reminder of Bradley sent a fresh wave of pain through me. We hadn't spoken since that disastrous dinner. According to mutual acquaintances, he had moved into a luxury apartment downtown paid for by his new executive salary and was regularly seen at business functions with Richard and Megan, the three of them playing happy family. "You're right," I said finally. "I've come too far to back down now." With renewed determination, I met with Sofia Diaz again to ensure my legal position was as protected as possible. I explained that I was concerned about potential structural issues with the house that might affect its value. "Have you informed your husband about these concerns?" Sofia asked carefully. "I've documented everything," I replied truthfully. "All legitimate inspections, all contractor visits, all renovation plans have been properly filed with both attorneys. If Richard has chosen not to read those documents thoroughly, that's hardly my responsibility." Sofia smiled slightly. "Mrs. Reynolds, you would have made an excellent attorney." The final piece of our plan fell into place when Frank informed me that the modifications were complete. The house was now effectively sitting on a time bomb. All that remained was to determine exactly when to light the fuse. "Once we activate the final phase, you'll have approximately 72 hours before major visible damage occurs," Frank explained. "After that, it will progress rapidly." I circled November 10th on my calendar, exactly 5 days before our court date and 2 days before the scheduled formal appraisal. It would be cutting it close, but the timing had to be precise for maximum impact. As that date approached, I began methodically removing the last of my personal belongings from the house. Clothes, jewelry, and smaller furnishings I cared about were gradually relocated to a small apartment I'd secretly rented across town. To casual observers, including the private investigator Richard had obviously hired to watch the house, it simply appeared I was decluttering before the sale. The night before our planned activation, Teresa came over with takeout and wine. We sat in the kitchen, surrounded by boxes and the echoes of what had once been a happy home. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" Teresa asked, refilling our glasses. I looked around at the house I had designed and loved, the space that contained 30 years of memories. Bradley's first steps in the living room, holiday gatherings in the dining room, quiet evenings reading in the sunroom. "Yes," I said firmly. "Richard took everything that mattered. He doesn't get to profit from the shell that's left." We clinked glasses in somber solidarity. In the morning, Frank would arrive to open the modified drainage valves. In 5 days, the foundation would begin to visibly crack. In 6 days, the formal appraisal would document extensive structural damage. And in 8 days, when we appeared in court, Richard would discover that his plans to cash in on our broken marriage had washed away with the compromised foundation of our once perfect home. The wheel of justice turned slowly, but revenge, as they say, is a dish best served cold, or in this case, wet. 3 days after Frank activated the drainage modifications, I was having lunch alone at Café Margot, a small French bistro outside our usual social circuit, when I spotted Bradley entering with a colleague. I hadn't seen my son in nearly 2 months, and the sight of him looking polished in an expensive suit I didn't recognize sent a painful jolt through me. He saw me too. After a moment's hesitation, he said something to his companion and made his way to my table. "Mom," he said stiffly, "you look different." I touched my silver bob self-consciously. "It's just a haircut, Bradley." An awkward silence stretched between us before he asked, "Mind if I sit for a minute?" I gestured to the empty chair across from me. The waiter appeared instantly, and Bradley ordered a sparkling water. "How have you been?" he asked once the waiter departed. "Surviving," I replied honestly. "And you? Enjoying your new position?" Bradley straightened his tie. "It's challenging but rewarding. Dad has me overseeing the new riverfront development project." "Impressive." I kept my tone neutral despite the mention of Richard. "The court date is coming up soon," Bradley said, lowering his voice. "Dad says you're still refusing his settlement offer." So this wasn't a coincidental meeting. Richard had sent his son to do his dirty work. "My attorney advises me the offer is inadequate given the circumstances," I replied carefully. Bradley leaned forward. "Mom, be reasonable. Dad's offering a clean split 50-50 on everything except the business. You'd still walk away with millions." "It's not about money, Bradley." "Then what is it about? Pride? Revenge?" His expression hardened. "Because Dad thinks you're planning something, and he's prepared for whatever it is." A chill ran through me. "What exactly did Richard say?" "Just that you've been acting suspicious. Renovations that make no sense this close to a sale, workers coming and going at all hours." Bradley studied my face. "He's appointed me to a permanent executive position, you know, not just a temporary role." The implication was clear. Richard had secured Bradley's loyalty by making him financially dependent on the company. "Congratulations," I said flatly. "I'm sure you earned it on merit alone." Bradley flushed. "You can't stand that I'm successful without your help, can you? Dad was right about you being jealous of anyone who moves forward while you're stuck in the past. Is that what he tells you? That I'm jealous?" I set down my fork. Appetite gone. "Has it occurred to you that Richard is using you to hurt me? That by turning you against me, he wins twice?" "Not everything is about you, Mom." Bradley's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from nearby diners. He lowered it again. "Dad says you knew about his unhappiness for years but chose to ignore it. He says you were more interested in maintaining appearances than in his happiness." The audacity of Richard's lies momentarily stole my breath. "And you believe him?" "I've seen the evidence," Bradley said. The separate bedrooms for the last 5 years. The way you controlled everything about the house. His schedule. His diet. The way you embarrassed him at company functions by talking about his health problems. Each accusation was a twisted version of reality. The separate bedrooms had been Richard's idea after he started coming home at unpredictable hours. My control of the house had been managing a home he showed little interest in, and the single time I'd mentioned his high cholesterol at a dinner was hardly public humiliation. Did your father also tell you about the offshore accounts he's been hiding? I asked quietly. Or about how his affair with Megan started over a year ago, not after our separation as he claims? Did he mention how he's been systematically transferring company assets to shell corporations to shield them from the divorce proceedings? Bradley's expression flickered with uncertainty before hardening again. He explained all that. The offshore accounts are legitimate tax shelters. The timing of his relationship with Megan is irrelevant, since the marriage was effectively over anyway. And the company restructuring is standard business practice. You have all the answers, don't you? I said, a deep sadness replacing my initial anger. Just like your father. I came here to help you, Mom. Bradley's tone was patronizing now. Dad's legal team is building a case painting you as emotionally unstable and vindictive. They have statements from friends, neighbors, even our old housekeeper. My blood ran cold. Are you part of this case against me? Bradley hesitated. They've asked me to testify about your behavior since the separation. And will you? I whispered, already knowing the answer. If it helps bring this whole ugly situation to a close, yes. He reached for my hand, but I pulled back. Mom, I'm trying to protect you. If you fight this all the way to court, everything will come out: the drinking, the erratic behavior, the threats you've made against Dad. Threats? What threats? The voicemails you left. The time you said he would regret what he'd done to you. I remembered that call made the night after discovering the affair, half a bottle of wine into my grief. I'd said he would regret throwing away our marriage, not that I would make him regret it. The distinction was crucial, but would be lost in a courtroom. I see, I said, reaching for my purse. Thank you for making your position clear. Mom, please, just take the settlement. Walk away with dignity. I looked at my son, Richard's son, in every way that now mattered. Did you know about Megan before I did? Bradley's eyes dropped to the table. The truth, Bradley. You owe me that much. Yes, he admitted. About 6 months before you found out. 6 months, I repeated. Half a year of watching me try to save a marriage that was already over. Half a year of family dinners where you and your father both knew he was sleeping with a woman your age. I asked him to tell you, Bradley said defensively. He said he was waiting for the right time. And in those 6 months, did you ever consider telling me yourself? Protecting me from the humiliation of being the last to know? It wasn't my place. I was your mother for 30 years before I was Richard's inconvenient wife. I cut in, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside me. But you chose sides long before you admitted it. I placed money on the table for my unfinished lunch and stood. For what it's worth, I did love you, Bradley said, looking up at me with an expression that mixed defiance with something like regret. But I have to live my own life now. As do I replied. Goodbye, Bradley. I walked out of the restaurant with my head high, not allowing myself to cry until I was safely in my car. The depth of the betrayal was breathtaking. My son, the child I had carried, nurtured, and loved unconditionally, had not only abandoned me, but was actively helping Richard destroy what remained of my life. Sitting in the car, I called Frank. How's the project progressing? On schedule, he reported. First signs of major stress should be visible by tomorrow morning. Good, I said, wiping away tears. No delays. Next, I called Sofia Diaz. I need to know exactly what legal exposure I have if certain structural issues with my house worsen naturally before the divorce is finalized. Naturally is the key word, Sofia emphasized. If you've properly documented pre-existing conditions and maintenance concerns, and if no direct tampering can be proven, your exposure is minimal. I thought of the meticulous paper trail we'd created: legitimate inspections, highlighting potential drainage concerns, renovation proposals that included foundation assessments, emails to Richard's attorney expressing worry about the property's structural integrity. I've documented everything, I assured her. That evening, I returned to the house, perhaps for one of the last times. In the basement, I could already see the first hairline cracks appearing where Frank had predicted, water seeping slowly but steadily through the foundation wall. Within 48 hours, according to his calculations, the damage would be undeniable. I walked through the rooms, saying goodbye to the home I had loved and the life I had built. In Bradley's old bedroom, I lingered, looking at the faded marks on the doorframe where we'd tracked his height through childhood. In the master bedroom, I remembered happier times before Richard's betrayal had poisoned everything. But these were just rooms now, shells emptied of meaning. The true home, the family, the love, the trust had already been destroyed long before any physical damage would become apparent. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Bradley says you're being unreasonable. Final warning, take the settlement or regret it. I didn't respond. In less than a week, Richard would learn exactly who would have regrets. November 15th dawned clear and cold. I dressed with particular care for court, a tailored charcoal suit that projected confidence without ostentation, subtle makeup that highlighted my features without attempting to hide my age, my silver hair styled perfectly. The woman in the mirror looked nothing like the desperate, heartbroken wife Richard had abandoned months earlier. Barbara arrived at my apartment at 8:30 a.m. to review our final strategy. Judge Montgomery is known for being fair but unsentimental, she reminded me. Stick to facts. Avoid emotional displays. And let me handle the aggressive questioning. I'm ready, I assured her. We've received word about the house, Barbara said cautiously. Richard's attorney filed an emergency motion this morning requesting the judge address the suspicious timing of the foundation damage. My heart raced, but I kept my expression neutral. The structural issues have been documented for months. It's hardly suspicious that they've worsened with the recent heavy rains. Barbara studied me carefully. Judith, I need to know if there's anything you're not telling me about the house situation. I can't defend you properly if I'm blindsided in court. The house was built on marshy land, I replied smoothly. The original builder warned about drainage issues. All of this is in the documentation we've submitted. She nodded slowly, not entirely convinced but unable to press further without evidence. We arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early. The corridor outside courtroom 3B was already crowded with divorce cases waiting to be heard, but I immediately spotted Richard and his attorney in intense conversation by a window. Megan stood nearby, looking uncomfortable in a conservative dress that couldn't quite disguise her youth. When Richard noticed me, he broke off mid-sentence and stared. I saw momentary confusion in his eyes as he took in my transformation, followed by a flash of something like doubt. Good. I wanted him off balance today. More surprising was Bradley's presence. My son stood slightly apart from Richard's group, nervously checking his phone. When our eyes met, he quickly looked away. Witnesses wait outside until called, Barbara murmured, noting my gaze. He's here to testify if needed. A court officer called our case at precisely 10 a.m. Judge Montgomery, a stern-looking woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and penetrating eyes, surveyed the parties as we took our places. I understand there's an emergency motion regarding property damage, she addressed Richard's attorney. Let's address that before proceeding to the main divorce petition. Harold Mitchell stepped forward with practiced gravity. Your Honor, my client has just learned that the marital home, valued at over $3 million, has suffered catastrophic foundation damage mere days before our court appearance. We believe this timing is not coincidental. Judge Montgomery turned to Barbara. Response? Your Honor, all structural issues with the property have been thoroughly documented over the past several months, Barbara countered, presenting a thick folder of reports. Mrs. Reynolds has repeatedly expressed concerns about the foundation given the property's location on historically marshy land. All of this information was shared with opposing counsel. We received hundreds of pages of renovation proposals, Mitchell protested. Buried within those was a single inspection noting potential drainage concerns. Nothing indicated catastrophic failure was imminent. The inspection specifically mentioned that heavy rains could exacerbate existing structural weaknesses, Barbara pointed out. We've had record rainfall this past week. Judge Montgomery reviewed the documents carefully before addressing me directly. Mrs. Reynolds, Did you take any action that might have contributed to the property's damage? I met her gaze steadily. No, Your Honor. I followed all recommended maintenance procedures and documented all legitimate concerns. The timing, while unfortunate, is simply a natural progression of existing issues. The judge turned to Richard. Mr. Reynolds, were you aware of these structural concerns? Richard shifted uncomfortably. I received some paperwork about renovations, Your Honor, but nothing suggesting the house was about to collapse. The documentation was provided to your attorney, I interjected calmly. If you chose not to review it thoroughly, that's hardly my responsibility. A flash of anger crossed Richard's face at my directness. Judge Montgomery considered for a moment. I'm ordering an independent structural engineering assessment before making any determination regarding the property. Now, let's proceed to the divorce petition itself. What followed was 3 hours of methodical legal proceedings. Richard's attorney presented him as a dedicated businessman whose midlife reassessment had led to an unfortunate but honest end to our marriage. They painted me as a controlling, bitter woman, unable to accept change gracefully. When it was my turn to testify, I remained composed despite Mitchell's increasingly hostile questioning. Mrs. Reynolds, isn't it true that you threatened your husband after learning of his relationship with Miss Thompson? I expressed my hurt and anger, as would anyone betrayed after 30 years of marriage. I replied evenly. Did you or did you not say, and I quote, "You will regret what you've done to me"? I said he would regret throwing away our marriage, I clarified. A prediction, not a threat. Mitchell shifted tactics. Your son Bradley has provided a statement describing your erratic behavior following the separation. Would you characterize your mental state as stable during that period? Before Barbara could object, I answered, I would characterize my mental state as appropriate for someone whose husband and son had both betrayed her trust. A murmur ran through the courtroom. In the gallery, I saw Bradley wince. No further questions, Mitchell said tightly. The most damaging testimony came from Patricia Marshall, who described my alarming emotional outbursts at social gatherings, conveniently omitting that these outbursts consisted of asking her to stop spreading gossip about my marriage. Throughout it all, I remained outwardly calm, though inwardly I was counting the minutes until we could address the financial aspects of the divorce, where our strongest evidence lay. When Barbara presented documentation of Richard's hidden assets and proof that the affair had begun long before our separation, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted perceptibly. Judge Montgomery's expression grew increasingly severe as she reviewed evidence of offshore accounts and backdated company transfers. Your Honor, Richard's attorney protested. These business arrangements are complex but entirely legitimate. I find it curious, the judge replied dryly, that so many legitimate arrangements were initiated immediately following Mrs. Reynolds' discovery of the affair. By the afternoon recess, Richard's confident smirk had disappeared. During the break, I overheard him arguing heatedly with Mitchell in the hallway. Fix this, he hissed. I'm not losing everything because you underestimated her. When we reconvened, Mitchell requested an unexpected adjournment. Your Honor, in light of today's proceedings, my client wishes to explore the possibility of a revised settlement offer. Judge Montgomery checked her watch. You have 30 minutes to confer. If no agreement is reached, we'll continue with the scheduled testimony. In a small conference room, Richard's new offer was laid out. An improved financial package, but still insisting on the sale of the house once structural issues were addressed, with proceeds divided equally. The house is unsellable in its current condition, Barbara pointed out. According to preliminary assessments, repairs would cost upwards of $1 million, which we both know wasn't the case until very recently. Richard snapped, glaring at me. I met his gaze calmly. Perhaps you should have read those inspection reports more carefully. The settlement negotiation deteriorated quickly after that. Richard was unwilling to concede on the business assets we'd uncovered, and I refused to accept less than my fair share of the company I'd helped build. We've reached an impasse, Barbara informed the judge when we returned to court. My client wishes to proceed with the trial. The remainder of the day was consumed by financial testimony, with forensic accountants detailing Richard's attempts to shield assets from the divorce proceedings. By the time Judge Montgomery called a recess at 5 p.m., Richard looked visibly shaken. We'll resume tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., the judge announced. I expect to hear testimony regarding the business valuation and continued discussion of the marital property. As we gathered our papers, Mitchell approached Barbara with another request for settlement talks. She looked to me for guidance. No more negotiations, I said firmly. We'll let the judge decide. Outside the courthouse, as Barbara and I discussed the day's proceedings, I spotted Bradley waiting near the steps. He approached hesitantly. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Just for a minute." Barbara squeezed my arm supportively and stepped away to give us privacy. "What is it, Bradley?" I asked, careful to keep my tone neutral. "Dad's falling apart," he said bluntly. "The company's at risk if this continues. People are starting to ask questions about the financial irregularities that were mentioned in court. And that concerns me how? Mom, please." Bradley ran a hand through his hair in a gesture so like Richard's that it made my heart twist. "This vendetta isn't just hurting Dad, it's hurting me too. My career is just starting." "Your career with the company your father gave you in exchange for your loyalty," I pointed out. "It wasn't like that," he protested, but without conviction. "What do you want from me, Bradley? Tell your attorney to accept the new settlement offer. End this before everyone loses everything." I studied my son's face, so familiar yet suddenly belonging to a stranger. "You chose your side, Bradley. Now you get to live with the consequences. Just like your father." I turned and walked away, my heels clicking decisively on the courthouse steps. Tomorrow would bring the final reckoning, not just for the house, but for 30 years of a life built on what had turned out to be shifting sand. By dawn on the second day of our court proceedings, news had reached me that the house's foundation damage had accelerated dramatically overnight. Frank called as I was preparing for court. "It's happening faster than we projected," he reported. "The south wall is showing major displacement. You might want to come see this before you head to court." I arrived at the house 30 minutes later to find water seeping visibly through the basement walls, the concrete floor already covered in an inch of murky water. Upstairs, ominous cracks had appeared in the living room walls, and several doors no longer closed properly due to the shifting foundation. "How long before it becomes critical?" I asked Frank, who was documenting the damage with his phone. "Hours, not days," he replied grimly. "I'd clear out anything you still care about immediately." I did a final walkthrough, confirming that nothing of true sentimental value remained. The house that had once been my pride and joy, the physical manifestation of 30 years of marriage, was literally sinking into the ground, a perfect metaphor for what Richard had done to our life together. As I prepared to leave, Frank gave me one last warning. "Once the main support wall gives way, it'll go quickly. The whole south side could collapse." "I understand," I said, feeling strangely calm. "Thank you for everything, Frank." Court resumed at 9 a.m. sharp. Judge Montgomery addressed the attorneys immediately. "I've received word that an emergency structural assessment of the Reynolds property was conducted at 7 a.m. today. The engineer's preliminary report indicates imminent structural failure, requiring immediate evacuation of the premises. Would either party care to comment?" Richard's attorney looked stunned by this development. Richard himself turned to glare at me, his face contorted with rage and suspicion. Barbara rose smoothly. "Your Honor, as the documentation we've provided demonstrates, the property's drainage issues have been a concern for some time. The recent heavy rains appear to have exacerbated these problems beyond anyone's expectations." "This is sabotage," Richard burst out, unable to contain himself. "She's destroyed the house to keep me from getting my share." "Mr. Reynolds, control yourself," Judge Montgomery warned sharply. "Unless you have evidence of deliberate damage, such accusations are inappropriate. The timing is impossible to ignore," Richard's attorney argued more professionally. "We request a formal investigation into the cause of this sudden structural failure." "So noted," the judge replied. "Now, shall we proceed with today's scheduled testimony regarding business assets?" For the next 4 hours, forensic accountants presented detailed evidence of Richard's financial maneuvers. His attorney fought valiantly to characterize them as standard business practices, but the documentation Barbara had compiled painted a damning picture of systematic attempts to hide marital assets. During the lunch recess, I received a text from Teresa with a video attachment. The footage showed water now gushing into the basement of our home, the foundation visibly crumbling in one corner. I forwarded it to Barbara without comment. When court resumed, Barbara immediately presented the video to the judge. "Your Honor, The situation at the Reynolds property has deteriorated significantly. Emergency services have been notified, but it appears major structural collapse is imminent. Judge Montgomery frowned. This is most irregular. Mr. Mitchell, does your client wish to address this development? Before his attorney could respond, Richard's phone buzzed with an incoming message. His face went pale as he viewed the screen. I need to go to the house, he announced, standing abruptly. Right now. Mr. Reynolds, we are in the middle of court proceedings, Judge Montgomery admonished. My house is collapsing, Richard shouted. All pretense of composure abandoned. She did this. She destroyed it to keep me from getting what's mine. Your Honor. I request a brief recess, Mitchell intervened, clearly trying to salvage the situation. My client is understandably distressed by this news. Judge Montgomery sighed. 1 hour. We reconvene at 2:30 p.m. precisely. As we exited the courtroom, Richard stormed over to me, Mitchell scrambling to intercept him. You vindictive bitch, Richard hissed, his face inches from mine. You think I don't know what you've done? Mr. Reynolds! Mitchell grabbed his arm. Not here. Several court officers moved toward us, alerted by the commotion. You said I was old and dead to you, I replied calmly. Maybe the house heard you too. Richard lunged toward me, but Mitchell and a court officer restrained him before he could make contact. The officer warned him about courtroom conduct as Mitchell hustled him away. Barbara looked at me with concern. Are you all right? Never better, I answered honestly. We spent the recess reviewing our strategy for the afternoon session, but at 2:15 p.m., Barbara received a call from the courthouse clerk. Judge Montgomery has been notified of a significant development at the Reynolds property, she reported. She's requesting all parties proceed there immediately. 20 minutes later, a surreal scene unfolded on what had once been my perfect lawn. Judge Montgomery, both attorneys, several court officers, and a court reporter had assembled to witness what could only be described as the slow-motion burial of our million-dollar home. The south side of the house had partially collapsed into a sinkhole created by the compromised foundation and saturated soil. Water pooled around the structure, continuing to undermine what remained of the foundation. Emergency vehicles lined the street, and neighbors gathered behind police tape to watch the spectacle. Richard had arrived before us and was shouting at a fire department official who was refusing to allow him to enter the unstable structure. That's my property, he yelled. I need to get my things. Sir, the building could completely collapse at any moment, the official explained for what appeared to be the third time. No one is going inside. When Richard spotted me arriving with Barbara, he broke away from the firefighter and charged in my direction. Look what you've done, he roared. 30 years of our lives, destroyed because you couldn't let me be happy. Richard, I replied evenly. The house was built on unstable ground. Much like our marriage, apparently. Something snapped in him then. With a wordless cry of rage, Richard grabbed my shoulders and shook me violently. Court officers rushed forward, but before they reached us, another figure intervened, Bradley, who had apparently followed the commotion from the courthouse. Dad, stop! Bradley pried his father's hands from my shoulders. This isn't helping. Richard turned his fury on our son. Get out of my way. She destroyed everything. You need to calm down, Bradley insisted, physically placing himself between us. There are police everywhere, and you're making things worse. You're defending her now? Richard's face twisted with disbelief. After everything I've done for you? In that moment, watching Richard's mask completely drop in front of our son, I felt a strange sense of vindication. Bradley was finally seeing his father's true nature, not the charming, successful businessman, but the entitled, violent man who believed everything and everyone belonged to him by right. I'm not defending anyone, Bradley said, his voice steadier than I'd heard it in months. I'm trying to stop you from getting arrested. A tremendous cracking sound interrupted the confrontation. We all turned to watch as another section of the house gave way, the master bedroom suite, where Richard and I had once shared our most intimate moments, sliding into the expanding sinkhole as if being swallowed by the earth. Judge Montgomery, who had been conferring with the emergency officials, approached our group with a stern expression. Given these extraordinary circumstances, court is adjourned until Monday morning, she announced. Mr. Reynolds, I strongly suggest you compose yourself before we reconvene. Your behavior today will certainly factor into my final judgment. Richard stared at her, then at the collapsing house, and finally at me. The fight seemed to drain out of him all at once, replaced by a hollow recognition of defeat. You've won, Judith, he said, his voice suddenly tired. Happy now? Before I could answer, he turned and walked away, shoulders slumped, the powerful man suddenly appearing old and diminished. The aftermath unfolded with surprising speed. News of the house's dramatic collapse and Richard's courthouse outburst spread through our social circle like wildfire. The revelation of his hidden assets and financial improprieties caused several business partners to distance themselves from Reynolds Real Estate. When we returned to court the following Monday, Richard's demeanor had changed completely. Gone was the arrogant, combative man who believed he could bully and threaten his way to victory. In his place sat a subdued figure who barely spoke as Mitchell presented a dramatically revised settlement offer. Under the new terms, I would receive 60% of all marital assets, full compensation for the now worthless house from our insurance policy, which, remarkably, did cover natural foundation, failure, and a 40% ownership stake in Reynolds Real Estate. My client wishes to conclude these proceedings as expeditiously as possible, Mitchell explained, not meeting Barbara's eyes. The settlement was far more favorable than anything we could have realistically expected from the judge. Barbara and I conferred briefly before accepting the terms with minor modifications. Judge Montgomery, appearing relieved to have the contentious case resolved, approved the settlement after reviewing the details. The divorce is hereby granted, she declared, bringing down her gavel with a decisive thud. May both parties find peace in their new beginnings. Outside the courthouse, I found Bradley waiting hesitantly by my car. I don't know what to say, he began awkwardly. I saw Dad grab you. I never thought he would. People show their true selves when they're losing, I said simply. Bradley nodded. I've resigned from the company. I can't work for him now, knowing everything I know. It wasn't an apology, but it was a start. The breach between us wouldn't heal quickly or easily, but the door had opened a crack. What will you do? I asked. I've had an offer from a firm in Chicago, he replied. I think some distance would be good for everyone. I nodded, understanding the complex emotions behind his decision. Keep in touch? I will, he promised. And Mom, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. 2 months later, I stood in the living room of my new home, a modest but charming 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood across town. The insurance settlement had provided more than enough to purchase it outright and establish a comfortable nest egg. Teresa helped me arrange the last of my furniture, much of it new since so little had been salvaged from the collapsed house. How does it feel? She asked, stepping back to admire the arrangement we'd created. I looked around at the space that was entirely mine, designed for my comfort rather than to impress others. It feels like freedom, I answered truthfully. That same week, I reopened my interior design business, starting with small projects but quickly attracting clients who had heard my story, many of them women emerging from their own difficult divorces and looking to create new spaces that reflected their reclaimed identities. Richard, I heard through the grapevine, had moved to Florida with Megan, his reputation in our community too damaged to rebuild. Reynolds Real Estate continued operating under new management, with my ownership stake providing a steady income. Bradley called regularly from Chicago, our relationship slowly mending as he established his independence from both his parents. 1 year to the day after Richard told me I was old and dead to him, I hosted a small gathering at my new home. Teresa was there, along with several new friends and clients, even Barbara Weston and her husband. As we raised our glasses in a toast, I found myself truly smiling, not the practiced social smile of the perfect wife I'd been for 30 years, but the genuine expression of a woman who had buried her past and emerged stronger from the ruins. To new foundations, I said, built on solid ground. What do you think you would have done in my situation? Would you have fought back or simply walked away? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if my story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of women who refuse to be victims. Remember, sometimes the most beautiful rebuilding happens after total collapse. Thank you for listening to my story, and may you all find the strength to stand your ground when life's foundations start to shake.